Here are some of the top stories we're watching this week. All eyes will be on New York as world leaders meet for the United Nations General Assembly. The UK's opposition Labour Party are gathering for their annual conference with Brexit top of the agenda. And we'll find out how H&M, the world's second largest clothing retailer, is faring. We'll start in New York, where world leaders are gathering for the UN General Assembly. The 193-member assembly will meet on Tuesday for the general debate, where leaders will discuss the biggest issues of the day. But much attention will be focused on a meeting of the Security Council on Wednesday, which U.S. President Donald Trump is due to chair. Nikki Haley, the U.S. ambassador to the UN, said earlier this month that the meeting would look at, quote, Iran's violations of international law, among other issues. The U.S. pulled out of the 2015 nuclear accord with Iran this year, and in August reimposed some sanctions that were waived in the deal. Here's Gideon Rachman with more on what to expect.
The annual meeting of the UN General Assembly in New York is always a place where there are big international political fireworks. Just last year, Donald Trump used it as a place where he lambasted the North Korean dictator Kim Jong-un and called him Little Rocket Man. And the possibility for the American president to use the UN meeting as somewhere where he can put his agenda forward and perhaps confront people in a way they will find uncomfortable is certainly there this year, because over the past year, America's skepticism towards multilateralism and towards the UN in particular has become even more evident. The president has pulled the United States out of the Paris Climate Accord, and controversially, he's pulled it out of the UN-sponsored Iran nuclear deal. So the question this year will be, does President Trump up the ante on this confrontational line towards the United Nations and multilateralism? And if he does so, how do the traditional American allies, particularly in Europe, such as Britain and France, that are permanent members of the UN Security Council, how do they respond? Did they try to paper over the differences with the Trump administration? Or are the cracks in the Western alliance going to only widen over issues such as Iran, climate and multilateralism?
Here in the UK, 13,000 delegates are descending on the city of Liverpool this week for the annual Labour Party conference. Many are hoping that leader Jeremy Corbyn will finally shift his position on the biggest issue of the day, which is of course Brexit. Ever since the 2016 EU referendum, Labour has accepted that Britain must leave the European Union, but Mr Corbyn is now facing pressure to back a new referendum on whatever deal Prime Minister Theresa May agrees with Brussels. However, the Labour leader is unlikely to give way. Delegates will be given some form of vote on Brexit, but are unlikely to be given a yes or no choice on having a second referendum. Meanwhile, Mr Corbyn's team is hoping to turn attention back to the issues where his party tends to perform well, which includes the NHS, schools and infrastructure. Here's our chief political correspondent, Jim Pickard.
Jeremy Corbyn stunned the political world in the general election of the summer of 2017 when his Labour Party seized 30 seats, mostly at the expense of Theresa May's ruling Conservative Party. People had not expected that the veteran socialist, with his unconventional foreign policy views, would be a hit with the British public. But he tapped into the zeitgeist and the growing unhappiness after 7 years of deep public spending cuts. But the last few months have seen Mr Corbyn struggling on various fronts, not least to contain a row about pockets of anti-Semitism within the Labour Party. The annual gathering of Labour is always a time for deep debate, but this year's session in Liverpool could be even more contentious than usual.
And finally, Swedish fashion brand H&M is due to report its third quarter results this week. It had a tough start to the year when it was unable to shift enough stock and had to slash prices to clear items. H&M said new systems have already been put in place to help manage stock, but this has also pushed up its costs. Analysts will be watching the margins closely and assessing the store's efforts to shift more towards online shopping. The FT's Jonathan Ely has more on the state of the UK retail sector.
So retailers in the United Kingdom are facing something of a perfect storm. On the one hand, their costs are rising, rents are going up, staff costs are going up, business rates are going up. On the other hand, their sales are barely growing at all, and more of their sales are coming online. Now that's a problem because you have to invest in websites and logistics, and at the same time many retailers have too many shops which have relatively fixed costs. H&M is no exception. They have issues with all of those things, and they're also here up against Primark, which competes very aggressively at that value end of the market, and the UK of course is Primark's home ground, so they compete very effectively here.
And that's the week ahead from the Financial Times in London.